Good morning and welcome to everyone, whether you're joining us from the United States, from Germany, or elsewhere around the world. My name is Jeff Rathke. I'm the president of the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies at Johns Hopkins University. And it's a real pleasure to have you and a distinguished group of speakers with us today. Our subject today is economic policy at home and abroad. And we are going to be exploring the domestic and international economic issues that confront the United States and with which the incoming Biden administration will have to grapple. And I'm really pleased to have my senior fellow and director of the AICGS Geoeconomics program, Peter Rashish, to guide and lead our discussion today. And I'm going to hand over to Peter and get out of everyone's way for this excellent discussion. So Peter, over to you.
Thank you, Jeff. Let me join in welcoming our terrific speakers and also all of you watching today, either in the United States or in Europe. Good morning and good afternoon. And we are today going to be looking at the incoming Biden administration's economic policies and what ramifications they have for Germany and Europe. One programming update, Heather Boucher, the CEO of the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, has had a change of plans and can no longer be with us. As many of you may know, she is considered to be a close advisor to the Biden-Harris transition team. And I think it's understandable that she had another engagement this morning that had to take precedence. Now, you can find the bios for our speakers on the event page on our website. So let me introduce them briefly, and I will do that in clockwise looking at my screen. I'll start with Tom Duesterberg, who is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. He has previously served as the CEO of the Manufacturers Alliance and also as an Assistant Secretary of Commerce for International Economic Policy. Stefan Meyer is the new director of the German Institute for International and Security Policy, also known by its German initials SWP. Stefan, before that, was a member of the executive board of the Federation of German Industries, BDI, where he was responsible for international affairs. Adam Posen is the president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics, position he's held since 2013. We're very pleased to say that the Peterson Institute is our neighbor on Massachusetts Avenue. And before that, Adam served on the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England. And Eugene Ludwig is the founder and CEO of the Promontory Financial Group. Before that, he served as the vice chair of Bankers Trust and also as the U.S. Controller of the Currency. We will have a moderated conversation, and then we will also look forward to taking your questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A function, and that way we'll be sure to get to it. And we'll aim to conclude no later than 11:15, let's say. Let me start off with a kind of headline question. And that is, what are the kinds of economic policy priorities that a new Biden administration is likely to have? What kind of policies do you think they should have, and what are the implications of those policies for close friends and allies like Germany and the European Union? Eugene Ludwig, you've served in the Clinton administration. Where do you think this next Democratic administration is likely to land?
Well, let me thank you very much, Peter. And it's great to be here today with everybody in this wonderful organization, which couldn't be more important in terms of our world. We've really got to glue it together, not pull it apart. So it's really a treat. And particularly be part of this with this distinguished panel. I think I'd like to answer the question in really two parts, which is one is domestic and one is international. And then have all kinds of caveats around this. I haven't, inside knowledge. I haven't been discussing every day, Joe and I having lunch, et cetera. So with that caveat. But it seems to me, in terms of the fine tuning of any program. You've really got to wait to see who his economic team really will be once it's chosen. We have a pretty good sense of who the candidates are, but until it's chosen and they will have influence on it, we're not going to know the fine points. But in gross, I think it looks like this. Clearly, they're going to try in the first 100 days to push through a blockbuster economic bill. Most likely, either one big, humongous bill that includes COVID relief, or two bills. One is COVID relief, and the other is genuine stimulus. Even though they call these COVID bills stimulus, in my own mind, I think of them as relief bills, actually. They sort of fill up the hole. They don't make for a new beginnings. And there will be tension depending on whether we have a Democratic or a Republican Senate or a tied Senate where the vice president can break the tie in terms of the size, the contours of it, et cetera. But I think that's where most likely they'll go. And if even just reading the public media, you're able to sort of piece that together, I think, pretty clearly. Over time, I think that is my own way of thinking what we should be doing in America. My own notion is that we have a bigger economic hole than is perceived, a little bit because of COVID, but mostly because of years of let's call deferred maintenance in terms of the economy. For me, I think what they should be doing is investing in America, and investing by way of infrastructure, education, the various bits and pieces that you've heard, Biden articulate and others. So I think that's what they should do, and I think it's likely what they will focus on. Obama focused on this, but getting it done and articulating it are two very different things. Now that's part one. Part two, in terms of the should, and I think the likelihood, but depends how real we all make it, is this. Of course, the president-elect is going to be much more open, even enthusiastic, to international camaraderie, joint programs, joint efforts for a better world than the current president. In that regard, it seems to me Germany in particular and the United States can together play an enormously important role. You have two mature economies, you have two industrial economies, and there are pluses and minuses in the way each of us goes about our business. It could be that there will be forces that view the landscape, Germany, US, as competitive. The US should do more machine tools. Germany doesn't want to give up wit in the car business, whatever the trade tensions could be. But that, I think, would be quite foolish because the world actually internationally has a lot of wood to chop. And these two countries working together have a huge opportunity, indeed responsibility, I would say, to get the economic engine moving forward. And it's been a bit stalled, not just by COVID, and not only moving forward, but in a way that satisfies the needs, the living wage needs of our citizens, US and German, but also thinks through in a more sophisticated fashion than's happened to date, how one can do that and also bring along the citizenry of the rest of the world. So very exciting time. I think the new administration will be very much open to those things. And this is an opportunity for one to think boldly because there's a lot to do. And also, I think there's will be big ears to listen in terms of how to do it.
Thanks. Stefan, listening to that, do you think that the kinds of policies that the new Biden administration is likely to bring in can be this kind of a source of greater cooperation, or do you also see risks that there could be some conflicts?
No, I would say it very much depends on how much the economic policy of a Biden administration is only inward looking, but also prepared to see economic policy as part of international affairs. I think we have several tasks to do, and we as the Europeans or Germans are very much interested to restore the economic relationship, which was damaged in the past 4 years, which means taking back tariffs on steel and aluminum, starting negotiations on subsidies to Airbus and Boeing. This is one part. I would expect that we really start to heal our economic relationship. The second one is that we really have to find a consensus on how to reform WTO, to take back the blockade of the appellate body, to make reform proposals together, how we deal with state-owned enterprises, how we deal with state subsidies. And this takes me to the third priority I would name. This is, let's discuss how we deal with China. Here in the past, I think we certainly could identify some common objectives. We very much differed about the strategy towards China, whether it should be decoupling or whether we should really further trying to integrate the Chinese economy and the world economy. But we need an exchange on this. I just saw a very interesting GMF paper on making an offer, so to speak, to Europeans and how we could find out consensus on China. I think a good starting point, and we really have to tackle this problem in the next month because I think it's getting more and more urgent.
Thanks. Adam, you know the German and the EU economy very well, and you just heard one American and one German give their views. What's your outlook on the likely policies to come and the chances for cooperation?
Thank you, Peter. I think that it's going to be very case by case, as it usually turns out to be, and the Americans will once again disappoint by not unreasonably in a pandemic putting their domestic divisions and their domestic needs first. Obviously, a better transatlantic relationship and better coordination with Germany and with the EU vis-a-vis China are in the American enlightened self-interest, and that's what we at Peterson Institute have been advocating. But I don't, in terms of forecast, I wouldn't expect much. I think if they want to get some early fruit, at the WTO ministerial in December 2017, there was basically agreed at the working level a common approach between Japan, EU, and US on subsidies through the WTO, which could be used to constrain China. And that's ready to go, and it's substantive. And I think if the Biden team were to take that off the shelf, DG Trade and EU would, and METI in Japan would be happy. And that would be a quick way to signal to China and to everyone that there is substantive alliance in a plurilateral, if not multilateral way you can act. I think the second issue is going to be, and this is of course something Eugene has worked on, is going to be how much the Biden administration and the Congress chooses to exercise unilateral financial sanctions. And this has been a recurring source of friction between the US and the EU and other allies, that the US tends to overuse sanctions without getting people on board, and whether it's vis-a-vis Iran or Cuba or Venezuela or other issues. And unfortunately, I think the Democratic Congress, just like the Republican Congress, is very eager to do that. So I worry that that will be an ongoing problem. I think thirdly, on the good news front, we just did an event across the street from you, Peter, at Peterson, or at these days, with Marco Butti, the chef de cabinet for Economics Commissioner Gentiloni. And, you know, the kinds of progress that the EU has made on fiscal policy, and particularly Germany shifting its views, I think removes one of the sore points that past democratic administrations had with Europe. I mean, the amount of resentment in the second Obama term from Treasury and the Fed and Commerce towards German economic policies contributing to worsening the euro crisis was quite substantial. And I think the moves that Germany and Europe together have made in recent months on European fiscal capacity are very strong. And that will help. The final thing I would just say, and I'm sure this is obvious to your many distinguished listeners, but Europe is, thank goodness, moving much faster than the US on dealing with decarbonization. And there will be both political and economic demands for some kind of border adjustment tax on imports from dirty industries and heavy industry abroad, including on the US. The Biden administration is going to move much faster, obviously, rather than backwards compared to the Trump administration, but probably nothing to compare to Europe, especially given the Republican Senate. You're not going to get a carbon tax, for example. And so there's going to be a real tension between the Biden administration, as they've already said, calling out individuals like Bolsonaro in Brazil and saying, you're a climate criminal, and then turning around to the Europeans and saying, oh, please give us time, don't make us lose the election in 2022 in the states where there's fracking. And this is going to require diplomacy to navigate. I think the Biden administration should try to do much more than they currently are doing, but given the Republicans in the Senate, they're going to be behind where the Europeans are no matter what.
Thanks. Tom, Adam mentioned the WTO and China, and those are two areas that I know you do a lot of work on, as well as technology. What's your view?
Well, let me just start with a couple sentences about what the first 100 days might look like. I think especially if you're going to have a Republican Senate, which will slow things down in a number of ways. I don't think you get a huge Obama-like stimulus package with the Republican Senate. But I think the priority is going to be getting people back to work, which means focusing on the response to COVID. And we've had some good news recently, so that's within the realm of the possible, I think. But also some sort of a repeat of the early response package to the COVID, which focuses on unemployment benefits until we get back to a growth economy and some help to the small business sector. It's just we've lost a huge number of small businesses, which have been one engine of growth for employment, but also for the overall economy, and it's a source of dynamism in the United States. So we don't want to lose too many more, and I think that will be a focus, so that the international component will probably have to wait a bit. And even there was an interesting article I think most of you have seen by Jake Sullivan and Jennifer Harris in Foreign Affairs in February, in which he said the predominance foreign policy has to give way in terms of priority to domestic industrial policy, if you will. And I think that will have to be taken into account, because I think that sentiment for rebuilding the US industrial economy, the economy as a whole, will be the priority. So WTO reform, I wholly agree with Adam that there is a template on the table, and that subsidy rules should be a priority. I also think that moving forward on some plurilateral agreements, such as we have on the table with the services sector, would be a way to build confidence in the system. But it worries me a bit that this emphasis on domestic industrial policy, which is present both in the United States and in Europe, is going to stand in the way of a robust set of new disciplines in the WTO or in plurilateral agreements on subsidies. And we have to think that through, because the tendency of a Biden administration will be, a fairly strong industrial policy. It could have been in a Republican administration. Trump had those tendencies as well. But it's much more pronounced, I think, in the Biden administration. And finally, I'd say, let's remember, let's do no harm. there are lots of, I agree with Gene, I agree with Adam, I agree with Stefan. We need to work more closely with our European friends, but also our Pacific Rim friends, especially with regards to some of the China issues, which I think maybe later we'll get into. But let's not create new problems. I mean, Adam mentioned the carbon tax issue. I think that would be the carbon border tax. I think that would be a problem. I think fairly aggressive antitrust policy with regard to the big technology sector in the United States would be a problem. I think the digital services tax would be a problem. It's not that those issues need to be addressed, but we need to do so in a way that doesn't exacerbate the tensions between the United States and its friends. I mean, there's some things the United States could and should do. Steel tariffs, I would agree with. We need to fix that. But let's not create new problems if we want to really get to the point where we get back towards the comity of, say, the 1980s and the 1990s.
Tom, you mentioned small businesses and infrastructure. If you look at how Biden campaigned, he did speak often about the need to invest in those areas, as well as strengthening labor unions, workforce development, and he also came out in favor of stakeholder capitalism. In a way, that sounds a bit like what in Germany you would call the social market economy. So my question is, do you think one of the messages coming out of the election, the US election, is that Americans want to shift more to this kind of economy? And if so, you know, looking a bit at Stefan, what are the lessons from Germany that they should heed if we do so?
Well, I mean, certainly going to try to move in that direction. I think we have to understand politically, this is still a divided country, and it does look like the Republicans will hold the Senate, but that's not a sure thing. They did pick up ground in the House. They picked up governorships. They picked up state legislatures. So I don't think he can move too much in the direction of, you know, a caricature, let's say, of a social market economy. I mean, that being said, I think there's some common ground, on both sides in the United States for a couple of things that the Germans do extremely well. One of them is the apprenticeship type system. You know, there's a growing recognition that the culture in the United States and the amount of money we put into realizing this culture of four-year college for everyone has got to shift. And there's lots of emphasis on building apprenticeships programs, building community colleges, lessening the burden on the next generation for going into debt. The German system of cooperation between the private sector, the education system, and public sector in general for framing apprenticeship systems, I think, is something that's being experimented with quite extensively in the United States, partly where German companies are present. The other thing that I think we'll see that I favor in lieu of, you know, outright industrial policy would be encouraging and allowing legally some research consortia. Germany has the famous Fraunhofer system, which I think has worked reasonably well in Germany. We've had experiments in the United States and things like the Sematech or earlier Comcast for satellites. There's a lot of concern right now with the state of the semiconductor sector in the United States. And I think maybe we need to think about, instead of outright subsidization, which is very much on the table in the United States, and which, as I said earlier, is a problem for the international rules-based, WTO-based order. We ought to think more about research consortia in addition to, you know, more robust federal investment in basic research. So those are a couple of thoughts along those lines.
I'd like to turn to Stefan, but before I do so, Gene or Adam, would you like to add anything to what Tom said?
I don't have much, but I just, I mean, this reflects the different backgrounds some of us have. I have always been opposed to both Germany and the US getting too obsessed with manufacturing. It's a distortion of, and generally leads to corruption and bad outcomes, as we saw with Boeing, as we saw with Kodak, as we've seen dozens of times. And the number of technologies that are actually national security sensitive are limited. Those should be very heavily protected, but that's not an excuse for messing around in the whole economy or wasting a lot of money. And Germany in particular has had its fetishization of autos and heavy industry, which has turned out to be lucky while China was buying and now unlucky when China's not. So, it's disappointing. We're seeing commonalities both in President Xi's recent 5-year plan, in President Biden's talk about Made in America, in the EU's recent discussions, that everybody is going back to defining resilience as a matter of domestic production and favoritism in government procurement. And this isn't as bad as Trump's tariff policies, but the useless end result is just as predictable. So it's probably hopeless, especially when talking to a German American audience, but I wish we wouldn't get as obsessed with this manufacturing industrial policy stuff as we are.
Well, I'd just say that as one analyzes what the new administration is going to do, there, I think certain lodestars that are worth focusing on. One, the president-elect is one of the most experienced politicians ever to take the office, right? He's been vice president. He's been a senator for decades. He's been part of sort of the official sector for a very long period of time with a very good record. He clearly is a cautious and really serious thinker and is devoted to try to leave things better than he found them. Build back better is a phrase we keep hearing. So and motivated, I think, notwithstanding that caution to do a lot that needs to be done. So I would say there's, in a sense, more opportunity than I think people recognize in terms of the Biden administration doing, really effective things to change the general tenor of the American economy, global economy, and global relations. And he obviously has contacts in nations around the world that are also pretty deep because he was vice president moving around. That again puts him in a whole different league than President Trump. The second thing I'd say is that two other things actually. He starts out having to dig out of a very big hole. This winter is going to be a big lockdown. We can already see it emerging. COVID probably will begin to get under control by the late spring or summer. But right now, it's a mess globally, but particularly in the United States. He's going to have a huge economic hole to dig out of. And the other thing to say is that tail risk is something that we rarely focus enough attention on, in my view. And tails often move human action in directions that we don't anticipate. Thinking through tail risk for the global economy, for the United States, et cetera, a worthwhile exercise for anybody who wants to worry a little bit about what could, really soak up a lot of administration attention or go wrong. And we rarely do that. We kind of think about the center of the distribution as opposed to the tails. But it's often the tails, whether it's 9/11 or it's a pandemic, that really aren't in the analytical framework when we actually think through what the likely results are. Look, I agree with a lot of what Tom, Adam, and Stefan have said. These are really early days. And until we see the shape of his own administration and the composition of the Senate, it'll be very hard to, for the blind man elephant story, to see much more than a little bit of the ear or the tail. We're not going to be able to see the trunk or the hooves yet.
Stefan, should Germany's experience with the does Germany's experience with the social market economy recommend itself to the United States?
Yeah, I would be really quite reluctant to teach any lessons from our experience, because I remember quite well some 15 years ago, we really identified our German version of social market economy as a main impediment for reform, economic reform, and competitiveness. At that time, we were seen as the sick man of Europe, and we made some changes to our social market economy, and I think the Americans should really look at the elements we have in that, like vocational education system was already mentioned. I think there's also some responsibility of the state to correct social imbalances, which is also part of our social market economy. But a transfer of the system or the model, I wouldn't really advise. I think our social market economy is a result of historical developments. It's deeply enshrined in our economic culture, so you can't simply transfer it. I just wanted to make a comment also on industrial policy, because I think we shouldn't equal industrial policy with a strong manufacturing sector, because I still would claim that the strength of the German manufacturing sector is not the result of industrial policy, but again, the result of specific historic developments of our strengths in certain technologies. Because I'm also very much concerned about too much focus on industrial policy. I think one of the results of the COVID pandemic is that we have a new balance in the relationship between state and private sector. From my point of view, the balance is now really skipping too much to the state, to a too active role of the state. I think we have to cut that back at a certain moment, and I don't see really much promising factors in a strong industrial policy. I agree very much with Adam Posen that there is a great danger that we use resilience as a pretense for protectionism and focusing on our own markets and reduce openness. So I'm really a bit concerned about what the effects of our focus on industrial policy might be on the global economy and the global trade.
You know, if I might just interrupt here 1 second, Peter, you know, it strikes me that, you know, in a sense, we, the panel, are playing a little defense, and of course have to. We don't know what the administration is going to look like exactly, et cetera. But I think this is a real opportunity, as I attempted to say in the second part of my first answer, for getting us on the offense. Let me get, in terms of better German-U.S. relations and better German-U.S. outcome. Let me give you an example. Republican, you know, Democrat around the center recognizes that U.S. educational system has to change, as I forget whether Tom said it or Adam said or somebody, maybe you, Peter. That is, we have to have a more holistic viewpoint in terms of post-high school education. And we have to have a better sense of a stakeholder versus a shareholder-oriented economic picture. And indeed, the Business Roundtable's already signaled that in a big way in the United States. Germany, in these areas of apprenticeship and a more, I would say, more thoughtful post-secondary educational approach, and successful one, and in stakeholder democracy, stakeholder business, has a lot of learnings and a lot of sophistication that would be welcome, not just by a Biden administration, but across the political spectrum within the, you know, sort of center norms. There is an opportunity, it seems to me, for those who are, you know, kind of internationalists, and I view myself somewhat in that camp, and others, we wouldn't be together at AICGS if we didn't share a desire to have joint efforts be successful. There's an opportunity, I think, you know, with some healthy amount of respect and who's in office, et cetera, to really reach out and assist in these areas and work together in these areas that would be, I believe, welcome and would be productive, both for the United States and Germany.
May I make a short comment on this, Peter? Because I think what is important to know about our vocational education system, and you certainly know this, Eugene, is that it's only partly state-driven to a very small part. It has to be accepted by the private sector. And I know that our German chambers of commerce in the United States, they started some vocational education programs. The participation of American companies in these programs is very low. When I look at the experience they made in Chicago and Atlanta, it was mainly German and some European companies who involved themselves in these programs, and only a very few American companies. So I think it's also really important to carry this discussion into the American private sector and the companies, because they have the main responsibility to carry away this program.
Very thoughtful, very, very thoughtful. Thank
you. During the campaign, certainly in Vice President Biden's campaign, but also sort of on the margins of the campaign, there was quite a lot of discussion of the need to make foreign policy, but also foreign economic policies work for the middle class, in order to sort of see international policies through the lens of domestic prosperity and particularly of strengthening the middle class. I would like to ask all of you, how could that be done? How realistic is it to do that? And if it is, how can that be done? How can, say, international trade policies or international financial and monetary policy cooperation be crafted in a way to make sure that in the first instance, they are at least not worsening inequities in the domestic economy and society?
Well, if nobody's going to start, I'll start. It seems to me that obviously this is difficult, but the one area where I think we all ought to be spending time is thinking about the enforcement of the rules of international trade, WTO, whatever. We have not been really wonderful about. We've been good at setting rules. We've been poor at enforcing rules, and oddly enough, I think one of the elements of domestic unhappiness, around illegal immigrants, is kind of different than just people's views on immigration per se. And I don't think that's been refined enough in terms of articulation. There are a lot of people who are not against immigration, but are really quite against illegal immigration and the lack of enforcement of the existing rules and living in a, kind of a state of, ruleless environment. I think that's true in spades internationally. And there are many commentators, and I'm by no means a trade expert, who point the finger in terms of, what's worst about U.S.-China relationships at the failure of living up to the standards that were set in trade agreements. This seems to me, in terms of both thinking through those standards, enforcing whatever standards we have, I think is a good place to start in terms of international cooperation. I'd say strengthening the framework we have, or deciding we want to have kind of a different framework for enforcement of standards.
Okay. Peter,
I'll jump in, and I basically agree with Gene, but there are limits to what trade policy especially can do to address the problems that are perceived, at least, and I agree that they're real problems. We have deindustrialized a good chunk of the manufacturing sector. So China is the elephant in the room, and they have not adhered to the agreements that they put their name to pretty systematically. And they do have a mercantilist policy, I don't know what else to call it, in which they take on sectoral sectors, they subsidize them, they try to acquire the technology any way they can, and they gradually drive foreign competition out of the market. You can see that in the telecom sector. Now, Adam's going to disagree with me, but I think one of the focuses going forward may have to be on the financial sector, because China has used that technique to some effect in financial services, namely in payment systems. China had agreed to allow foreign competitors, not just Americans, but Europeans, Japanese as well, into the financial sector starting in the mid-2000s, but systematically kept most competitors out. In the meantime, I mean, the Chinese are good. You have to give them credit. They built these payment systems that are widely used. They closed off their market. They have a market of what, over 1 billion people. They have hundreds and hundreds of millions using Alipay and the 10-cent version. And you can see how successful they were by the size of the Ant public offering, which was killed by Xi Jinping last week or the week before. Again, returning to Gene's point, we do need to cooperate. I don't think we're going to get China to back off on these types of policies unless we have a more united front. And hopefully we can achieve that. Biden clearly wants to go in that direction. But Germans, for instance, and Stefan can contradict me if I'm wrong, are somewhat ambiguous about this. The Chinese have put a fair amount of pressure on Chancellor Merkel, for instance, not to join the United States on sanctions on Huawei. And Germany is more exposed than we are. So to sort of sum up, I think we need to keep at this. We need to use the WTO. We need to try to get new rules into the WTO. But I doubt if we're going to be really successful unless we have more help from some of our friends around the world, not just in Europe, but Pacific Rim and possibly India.
So I actually don't disagree on the facts of Union Pay, really more than Ant, which was the beneficiary of China failing to live up to its WTO obligations, and it's the finding that Visa, MasterCard, and others were unfairly shut out of the Chinese market. I mean, it's actually probably about the worst example of China not living up to a WTO decision, since most decisions that have gone against them they have complied with, and that one they didn't. But I also don't think that has very much to do with the outcome of the middle class in the United States. The outcome of the middle class in the United States has more to do with a host of Republican policies for the last 40 years that are about making the tax code less progressive, reducing the size of the state, shifting the burden of taxes from business and business owners to working people, cutting back the amount of provision of the welfare state. And the bottom line is that the degree to which the US is a complete outlier versus Western European and most East Asian societies and most Pacific societies at a similar income level is because of our domestic politics. All of those societies are completely exposed to the same trade and the same China. And it doesn't correlate with whether they have trade surpluses. It doesn't correlate with whether they have market share in China. What it simply correlates with is whether you have universal health insurance, whether you have adequate labor protections, whether you have a tax code that isn't excessively crazy like Denmark or Germany in the 80s, but isn't excessively crazy in the other direction like in the US, and whether you have sufficient public investment in education and other things that others have mentioned. And if Biden thinks that by scapegoating trade and China, he can get through some of those things, then that's probably worth it. But I also think it's ridiculous because the Republican Senate's not going to let him do any of those things. So what's the point of scapegoating trade? There are a bunch of opportunists and various think tanks, not AICGS or Peterson, who have tried to cloak their foreign policy ambitions and their personal ambitions by tying everything to this middle class. And, you know, fine, but none of us who are speaking honestly should kid ourselves. The other point about the middle class in the US is that it's really, as we've seen in these elections, it's not uniformly one-to-one, but is very tied to racial identity and racist attitudes. As the social scientists, the economists Alesina and Glaser years ago pointed out, part of the reason the US has such a limited welfare state is because we're more racially diverse than most of our democratic neighbors and allies. And our people take that racial diversity as not wanting people who don't look like them to get money. So, you know, in the end, that's what this is about. And if the Biden administration feels the frustrations of the Republican Senate, you know, I feel for them. I hope they don't just go off on international or China, not because China isn't evil, or rather not the people of China, not because the Chinese Communist Party is an evil, of course it is, but because it's not going to do anything for the middle class.
Well, let's take those points as a starting point. If we do that, you know, and you look at Germany, I mean, the BDI, where Stefan used to work, or the German government has certainly both, and other institutions in Germany have sharpened their view of China, even with their sort of different approach to domestic policies. And so I think that's noteworthy. And my question would be, you know, is there an inevitable, to look at China more directly here, is there an inevitable, not decoupling that has to happen, but is there an inevitable trade-off, at least to some degree, between efficiency and security when the United States and Germany look at their trade and investment relationships with China? And I'd like to hear from all of you, but especially I'd like to hear from Stefan, to ask whether you think in Germany, public opinion or the political class believe that, and if so, are they willing to expend some capital to try to convince voters that at some point that kind of trade-off, even if it's not to a great degree, will need to be faced? Anyone like to jump in on that?
No, I think it's not immediately about security. The discussion we have in Germany, and you're perfectly right. We have increased sensitivity with regards to China. We are also sharpening our position. Not only my former position in BDI, we have the same discussion on a European level with Business Europe, and in the political class, I think there is a very broad consensus that we have to get tougher on China, but less because of security, but more about, can our economic vulnerability we certainly have with regard to China used to put political pressure on Europe, and this is certainly a rising concern, and I see some progress, as I said, both in the private sector as well as in the political class to deal with this question. So I'm quite a little bit more optimistic than Tom that there might be a basis also in Europe to find a consensus, a transatlantic consensus on how to deal with China, how to enforce rules, how to set up new rules in the WTO, but also how to protect, what kind of instruments to use to protect our market economies against state capitalist interference. We certainly see in investment and in many other fields, public procurement, dumping, and all that. So I think that there is a sound basis for that now in the meantime in Europe. And if the choice we get from the Americans is not, you have to decide whether you are with us or against us, but let's discuss the strategy, our common strategy towards China. I think Europe is more than prepared to get involved in this in such a discussion.
Let me just remind everybody, if you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A function to do that. Would anyone else like to comment?
Yeah, Peter, I'll be very quick.
Sure.
I do think on a bipartisan basis in the United States, there's a rethinking of, to oversimplify the idea that economic efficiency is the single most important goal of economic policy. I think people understand that there are going to be trade-offs if we're going to meet the sort of socio-political, cultural goals that we have for our society. They're going to be trade-offs. That's what politics is all about. On the question of decoupling, I don't see how you can make any other conclusion than that China has decided to decouple from the world. Not they want to trade. They want to trade on their own terms. But if you look at Made in China 2025, you look at the Belt and Road program, you look at their Standards 2035 program, it's all designed to have sort of an autarkic, mercantilist system. If we want to participate in that, we have to participate on their own, on the Chinese terms. So granted, China can make stuff a lot more cheaply than we can, but we and I, I'm with Stefan. I would like to see a lot more cooperation with our friends, but I think we all have to admit that it's going to be a trade-off in terms of, in many cases, you know, the price of goods, services, whatever, and achieving the cultural, political goals that we want to achieve.
Well, I agree so deeply with a number of things Tom and Stefan have just said. One, I think that any hope here in terms of really reshaping things vis-a-vis China has got to be transatlantic to be successful. The second thing is, I agree with Tom, in the United States at least, there's really a rethinking on the classical economic efficiency view, because the question, I think, is efficiency for whom? Or another way to put it, I guess, is you know, the consequences of classical economic efficiency, and there are a number of recent studies on this. There, I would say one thing that is a ringer in the discussion, which you know, would take a whole nother session or two, is the degree to which technology has really changed the shape of the you know, sort of efficiency discussion, both domestically and internationally. It is the powerhouse of economic change, you know, now and in the future. So, for example, the thought over time that it's simply labor that makes things cheaper, as distinct from artificial intelligence, you know, sort of new kinds of computer manufacturing techniques, I think deserves a, you know, very hard look. But I agree really with what's been said, and I think it's very important what's said in terms of getting together and thinking about a transatlantic thought. Oh, the other thing I would say to Tom is you said about China, really, I thought it was also very smart decoupling. I'm not sure in their own minds they were ever coupled. China views itself as the center of the universe. They've always viewed themselves as the center of the universe. It's only we who think that they really ought to be part of this kind of international westernized system. I don't think they've ever thought that.
Can I say something about economic efficiency?
Please.
The real arguments against excessive industrial policy, trade protection, various arbitrary forms of government intervention are not about efficiency writ small, that we encourage there to be a smaller labor share in the economy and the US should compete on a low wage basis, for example. That's a political decision, and it's been a wrong political decision. It's not economic efficiency. The reasons one worries about these excessive industrial policies and talks about economic efficiency is threefold. First, that as we've just seen viscerally with the Trump administration, that if you give government too much intrusive power, then you get corruption. Second, if you give government too much intrusive power, you diminish innovation. And third, if you give government too much intrusive power, you end up reducing investment overall. Now, there is perfectly good reason to talk about something that isn't labeled industrial policy, but should be, which is how do you promote proper amounts of investment in your workforce and in technology? And so that people will call this neoliberal perhaps, but I'm actually much more lefty on the public investment side than the neoliberals traditionally are, and I've been saying that for 20 years. So I think there's a lot of room to have an industrial policy that consists of very large-scale public investment, including in workers' communities, but also in technology. I think there's a lot of room for a competition policy that breaks up monopolies or oligopolies in the digital sector and in other sectors in order to increase innovation. These are things that generally what people call industrial policy go in the wrong direction. And so I think the Biden administration, I believe, is considering, and I hope will consider, simply calling a pause on all trade initiatives after rescinding and reversing some of the stupidest, most self-destructive of the Trump administration executive orders, including the tariff threats on Europe and the national security tariffs, where I just have no national security basis vis-a-vis Europe or Canada or such. But I think after that, they will not be looking to initiate anything on trade early. And that pause should be used to talk about what is the enforcement, as some people mentioned, what are the labor standards and the environmental standards going forward, what are the investments in the public that have to come first, what are the things like ISDS that should be left behind. And the German, back when that was a hot issue in TTIP, the German proposals about having a sort of public ISDS as opposed to some private sector self-appointed arbitration, I think were very helpful. Similarly on tech, if we have German-American, German-French-American, EU-American agreements that the point that there are things on privacy, for example, and on property rights of people's information that the Americans can usefully take from Europe, those should be applied to the American technology giants, digital giants, but it shouldn't be policies, as Bruno Le Maire talked about creating a German alternative or a French alternative or a European alternative national champion. I'd rather have a breakup of the Americans, but not some artificially created European megalith, just like the Chinese have done, in the sense of having an artificially created megalith. And finally, I think the most important social justice issue politically as well as economically, where Europe and the US can get together, is the adjacent issue of international taxation, of avoiding base erosion and profit shifting of multinationals, including notably the digital people, but not limited to those. And as Larry Summers said in a presentation he gave last week via the Peterson Institute, some of the French proposals are fine, and the Americans should join up with the French proposals on international taxation. So I think there is a perfectly fine, positive transatlantic agenda we can have, and it's not about economic efficiency, but it's also not about pandering to special interest groups dressed up as industrial policy.
Adam,
Let's.
I'm sorry.
Sorry.
No, I agree with much of what you said, but it seems to me if one's going to look at the Biden administration, say, how to cut through what will be certainly initially, a domestic focus in terms of a number of issues, has to be, given the state of things post-COVID or during COVID. Climate change is one thing in which the Biden administration has been very clear in terms of its priority. It's obviously an area in which Europe is a leader and is very clear about its priority. And therein lies all kinds of positive directions in terms of trade, cooperation, including yeah, I hate to use the word reindustrialization, but a different kind of technology-driven industrialization that can benefit, all the relevant countries. That's coming whether, one way or the other, and it happens to be an issue, I think, in which the incoming administration and most European states would agree.
Well, you've addressed some of the questions you've gotten from the audience, so let me throw one out to you. It was, I think, Adam, you were the one who mentioned it a bit before, where there was a question about the German trade surplus with the United States, current account surplus. The question is it likely that the Biden administration, as the Trump administration before it and as the Obama administration before it, is going to make a big point of that bilateral trading relationship? Or maybe I would add to the question and say, is the fact of the Next Gen EU recovery program, is the fact of the German temporary suspension of some of its deficit rules, do those things make it moot because on the German and European side, the change of thinking is so advanced that a Biden administration won't have to make such a big deal of German current account surpluses?
Well, for what it's worth, Peter, I think, as Marco Butti indicated in the discussion we had earlier this morning, it's still to play for. Whether this is a one-off or whether this is a Hamiltonian moment for Europe is still to be determined over the next several months or year, in part through how they deal with this rule of law attempts to avoid a veto with Hungary and Poland, in part, and do they go intergovernmental or keep it within Europe? In part in how much take-up there is from Spain and Italy of the new funds that are available, the next generation funds, in part how much the funds go on. I think the way to look at the significant moves Germany and all but the Frugal Four advocated in Europe over recent months is that it removes some of the basis for hostility and misunderstanding between the US and Germany or the US and Europe. I don't think it removes the need for additional coordination. Rather, it opens up the opportunity for a more positive agenda. And that's the spirit in which I hope and I frankly expect that US and Germany can go forward on. But I do think, going back to where you started, Peter, that the focus on Germany's trade surplus does get reduced if the German government is willing to show solidarity with the rest of Europe and not be pursuing essentially quasi-mercantilist policies. And I think that's a win-win in Germany's own self-interest, both in terms of avoiding conflicts inside the Euro area and across the Atlantic, and because a Germany that is excessively dependent on trade surpluses ends up underinvesting in its public infrastructure, as Stefan and Tom and everyone on this call is well aware has happened in Germany. So I don't see it as Germany getting sensible and under the current version of the Grand Coalition making progress domestically and across Europe on fiscal policy as removing the need for American-US. I see it as enabling American-US to move on to more positive things.
Stefan, how do you see that?
Yeah, I very much agree with Adam. I think we certainly need more investment in public infrastructure in Germany, which might reduce our trade surplus, especially also with our European neighbors. And we have to take over more responsibility. And I think the Next Generation Fund is a clear sign that Germany and German government is prepared to do so. I would argue that we have also done so in the past in the Euro crisis with our support to Greece and Italy and Spain and other countries, but not at the same level as we have reached right now. And so I'm also quite hopeful that we can overcome Poland's and Hungary's resistance to this Next Generation Fund, because I think it really is a new quality of solidarity we have in Europe.
Okay, good. Maybe one more question from the audience, and it has to do with climate policy. We've discussed it a bit, it's expected that the Biden administration, perhaps the first action will be to go back into the Paris Accords. I like to ask how much of an emphasis you think the administration will put on that, but specifically, if I could just focus it a bit, what are the chances that the US and the EU could find common ground on carbon border taxes? Because I think it was mentioned that could be a source of friction. Is that something, would a US-EU agreement in that area not only be possible, but could that set the pace for something broader among WTO members?
I agree with Tom. It depends on the shape of the U.S. Senate and U.S. politics. It isn't that I think the Biden administration itself wouldn't be courageous in this area. I think it's what's the art of the doable. Having said that, there are a lot of things that can be done short of a carbon tax that can reshape the climate landscape. And I think there will be a huge openness in the Biden administration to do that. But as desirable as it might be, and maybe it's possible to articulate a US-European position, I'm not sure that we just don't know yet the shape of US politics will allow it.
Right.
Peter, could I weigh in on that?
Sure, Tom.
I don't know how far the Biden administration will push things. I mean, there is a element within the party and in the general public to go more aggressively towards something approaching a Green New Deal. Whether or not that's politically viable, I don't know. We'll have to see. But there's another interesting question, I think, and I'm going to sound like a one-trick pony, but going back to China. China, at the recent party planning conference, set itself the goal of either doubling or tripling per capita income by the year 2035. And China is the biggest emitter of carbon in the world. We all know that, and their commitments were to peak in 2030, I think, and to increase the reduce energy intensity of their economy. So I did some just rough calculations, and if you take the low estimate, which is doubling per capita income by 2035, and if you assume that China will increase their, continue reducing their energy intensity at the same rate they have in the last 15 years, which is roughly 40% over that time frame, you get a amount of carbon that they would be putting into the atmosphere, which will at that time be about 3 times what the United States is doing now. So I guess one could argue that they're still meeting their commitments, but couldn't they be a little bit more aggressive about this? And wouldn't that be something that would be interesting if we're all going to push in that direction? Can't we bring them more into a responsible policy, if you will, that really makes some difference in what we're trying to accomplish?
Right. Okay, well, I think we've had an incredibly rich discussion. I hope the viewers agree with me that we have a much clearer-eyed sense of what is likely to come from the Biden administration, and also have gotten some good pointers on how this incoming administration might want to think about some of its domestic and foreign economic policy challenges, and crucially how those not only could impact Germany and the EU, but also how they could be the basis for a stepped up cooperation, which is always a good message to have. And let me just say, Gene, thank you very much earlier for that great programming suggestion, and I hope that we will move to that at AICGS in the coming weeks and months. So with that, let me thank all of our superb speakers today, and thank all of you for tuning in. the event will be posted to our website, the recording, in case you'd like to check up on it again. And with that, we wish you a good rest of the morning and afternoon.